The men who wrote the Constitution were intelligent men, they were educated men, and they were very dedicated men. They had read the Bible, they knew the prophets and the teachings of Jesus. They knew how easy it was for even men of God to sin. They knew the ease with which evil men gain power, and they knew how quickly power corrupts. They had read Plato and Aristotle. They knew what had happened to Aristotle's student Alexander. They knew the Greek states and how they had initially prospered, but then lost to Rome. They'd read Shakespeare, and they knew about human weakness. They knew how Rome had grown as a republic and how it fell with an emperor. They knew how Egypt had become weak. They had studied the writings of Bradford. They knew his diary. They knew what had happened to the Pilgrims, how share and share alike had failed, and how when they finally went to every man for himself, they had abundance and the first Thanksgiving. Adam Smith's book, Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, had been published in 1776 and was available to the writers of the Constitution in 1787. They knew the history of the separate colonies, who had different forms of government. The Constitution they developed was a wonderful document. It was to prevent an imperial president. It was to have rule of law, not rule of man. They wrote the Federalist Papers in order to educate the people about them. With the Constitution, and even with the Civil War, the United States became the richest country in the world. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The manifesto's language has become the language of the intellectual community. His 10-point manifesto has become the lens through which intellectuals look at the world. The utopia that he promised was to come under communism after socialism. This utopia has been accepted as something to go for and worth killing for. So far, over 100 million people have been killed by this document. The world at the time was still agrarian, and some points don't fit the present time, but the true believers were not dissuaded and press on to what they fit into the modern world. To get followers, envy is required. Envy is a key to get Marx's principles adopted. The various movements to adopt Marx have been called Marxist, progressives, communists, liberals, socialist, and the latest term, open society. The most important of Marx's principles was the income tax. The income tax was introduced in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson. The top rate started at 7% and became 77%. The world at the time was still agrarian, and some points don't fit the present time, but the true believers are not dissuaded and press on to what they can fit into the modern world. To get followers, envy is required and has become part of political speech. The key for Marx was to destroy the middle class, to bankrupt industry and allow the government to take over industry. At the same time we had the income tax, we had the direct election of senators. Election of senators by state legislatures was put in the Constitution to prevent the imperial central government. This check on the federal government was an impediment to the progressives. If a magazine or newspaper said anything against Roosevelt, he had their mailing privileges revoked. The Federal Communications in 1934 was needed to allocate radio frequencies. It quickly turned into the censorship business. The Federal National Mortgage Association in 1938, and later addition to the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, the FHA, the Student Loan Program, the Small Business Administration, all were drains on the capital of the United States. Saul Alinsky wrote 2 books, Reveille for Radicals and Rules for Radicals. He used the Great Society departments in an attempt to bring down the US government. Alinsky's rules were to bore from within, to bring down the government by expanding government programs until the system collapsed. His enemy was the haves, and his idea was to have the have-nots take it away. The goal he prescribed was social justice, but he never said what that was. Opponents, he said, were to be ridiculed and never seriously debated. They were to be called bigots, fascist, homophobe, sexist, anti-Semitic. It didn't matter. They were to be called names rather than debated, because in a debate he recognized communism and this fuzzy thing he called social justice couldn't stand up. Carter started the Department of Education. The progressives have used this ever since for indoctrination. George Soros, who started what was called the Open Society, was a Marxist and Alinsky follower. He founded many organizations, some of which are easy to identify because they call themselves progressive or Marxist. But most are simply fuzzy words like education and children and materialism. But his idea is boring within. The Occupy movement is a George Soros funded organization. I've said how we got here, but now the question is, how do we fix it? Karl Marx gave his followers a roadmap on how to go to socialism and communism. We should use the same roadmap. If you had a map that went from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, you could use the same map to go from Pittsburgh to Cleveland. Step 1 is to eliminate the income tax. There are a group of people in Texas that came up with what they call the fair tax. It's House Bill 25 and Senate Bill 25. It eliminates the income tax. It is not progressive, and it takes us a giant step away from Marx. We need to repeal Amendment 16 to be sure it doesn't come back. But once people have gotten off the income tax, I don't believe you'd ever be able to get them back. Step 2 is to sell the government's ownership in all of the businesses. We'd have to do this over a little bit of time, but once people realize that the government is not going to be in businesses, it'll sell at a better price. Step 3 is to get the government out of the loaning money business. Just as Adam Smith said, the government, when they decide where capital goes, cannot do a good job. So we need to get the government out of all of the loan programs that it's in. Repeal the inheritance tax. Inheritance tax has broken up family farms, and it has destroyed small businesses. Persons inheriting estates can either spend it and be taxed, can invest it, which grows the economy, or give it to charities. In all cases, society benefits. Step 5, keep the government out of regulation of the internet. Things like libel, copyright, fraud, child pornography are crimes, and they can be prosecuted without regulating the internet per se. The internet has become the power for the people, and that's why the government socialists, communists, liberals want to regulate it. Step 6 is to use vouchers as an alternative to public schools. It also involves eliminating the Department of Education. With vouchers, people will get the best for their children, and this will be the best for the country. The final step is the one to be used during all of the steps. We need to call out the Marxist, socialist, progressives when they use the Alinsky techniques. We need to call them and say, this is an Alinsky technique being used by an Alinsky follower. People won't understand that at first, but I think when people do research and find out something about Alinsky, they'll know what's happening and they'll know it will work. I'm glad Newt Gingrich said something recently about Alinsky, and he has introduced it to the public.